So this is Christmas, and what have we done? I love that composition, Happy Christmas, War is Over, by John Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, because it's not an indictment so much as it is an invitation, reminding us that in this season in which we celebrate the birth of one of the most radical peace activists and organizers of beloved community to ever live, Jesus of Nazareth, that the onus is on us to actualize his ministry of love and giving and sacred siblinghood all these millennia later. A few years before Happy Christmas was released, John Lennon got into a little trouble trying to remind us of this in a slightly inelegant way. On the American leg of the Beatles' 1966 tour, Lennon was asked about the almost deification of the band during Beatlemania and claimed that they were more popular than Jesus. Quote, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right. I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." John didn't, of course, mean that Jesus was irrelevant. He meant that the messages of love and cooperation that had been integral to Jesus' ministry were perhaps, for this new generation, being more clearly expressed by his ragtag group of Liverpool rockers. That kids were choosing to worship around the turntable instead of the church because they heard something on those 45s and 33s that they weren't hearing in the pulpit. But for his sin of youthful, exuberant honesty, Lennon was crucified by the media. He and his pals received a torrent of death threats. There were organized album burnings all over America in retribution for his perceived heresy. The Beatles stopped touring altogether shortly thereafter, and subsequently began somewhat separate spiritual and emotional journeys, dabbling in Hinduism, New Age therapy, psychedelics, to try and find a modicum of peace and internal centering for themselves. All of this led to their disparate and sometimes confrontational interpersonal relations on full display in the epic 8-hour Get Back documentary that was released around Thanksgiving this year. The film chronicles the Beatles' last recording sessions of their albums Let It Be and Abbey Road, the culmination of their decade-long, we often forget they were only a band for a decade, journey through nearly every conceivable genre and permutation of pop music. They sort of invented punk, metal, grunge, electronic, even influenced hip-hop with their use of creative production techniques. And this documentary is a gift not only for music lovers and fans of the band, but because it's so much more. It's truly a documentary of community, relationship, marriage, of the enduring power of the creative process when so many external forces beckon us towards destructive ends. Money, power, ego, control. John, Paul, George, and Ringo are just struggling to keep it together despite all these, trying to keep loving one another, trying to keep making something worthwhile, purposeful, meaningful. When I was a kid, I was a John guy. I was drawn to his rawness, his honesty, his anger. He didn't give a damn about how he came off, and I dug that. The confidence. But as I got older and learned more about him as a man, listened intently to some of his songs that convey the depth of trauma and pain he carried, the mistakes and missteps he made throughout his life, I came to realize just how hard-earned his journey toward peace was. He was a deeply troubled man, lonely, scared, stuck in a sort of perpetual adolescence. He was a jealous guy. He told us as such. Many of his younger Beatles songs display a pretty toxic, controlling version of masculinity. He was also susceptible to cynicism and apathy, writing often about seeking refuge in deep, long, drug-induced sleep, where he could just shut out the world in a foggy stupor. And he also tended toward the darkly absurd, even juvenile. Everybody had a wet dream. Why don't we do it in the road? John Lennon's journey as a songwriter skewed toward the careless and ramshackle, while his brother in poetry, Paul McCartney, tried, often in vain, to keep the tunes more finely tailored to the mainstream. And for a while, I will be honest, and I'm not proud of this, but I held that against Paul. Recognizing his genius as a pop stylist, but always thinking of him as the commercial compromiser, as the money man, the square. I never loved him in the way I did his brothers, but it's because I didn't understand how much his desire for control was rooted in his own fear of losing the only real friends he'd ever known. In my own call to ministry, my affections turned to, and I began to be deeply influenced by, George Harrison. I found his spiritual exploration and commitment to an intimate love of divinity to be so appealing, more holistic and transcendental than the material concerns of John or Paul. He seemed to exude peace. He seemed to be able to write in a way in which his love was expressed both for a spouse or lover and to God at the same time. He befriended Bob Dylan and Ravi Shankar. He seemed to have it together in a more sustainable way than Johnny did. Seemed so much deeper and more committed to the Spirit than Paul ever was. And then, of course, nestled in his octopus's garden is Richard Starkey, Mr. Ringo Starr. It never occurred to me in any phase of my life that Ringo Starr might be my favorite Beatle. It was never obvious to me in my youth and young manhood just how important his steady beat was, not just to the music, but to the rhythms of the heart of his fans and bandmates as well. Ringo's even-keeled, steady nature, his very stability and commitment, rendered him so often completely invisible to me, and I bet to many others, except you, maybe. When you watch these four men in their late 20s trying to maintain their marriages to powerful and insightful women, trying to be true to themselves in their spiritual journeys, trying to collaborate and communicate with the only other people on the planet capable of understanding them, and yet failing to do so nonetheless, it's a sobering sight. The Beatles were, for a time, spreaders of the good news in a way far superior to that of Western white Christianity. They spoke to us of love and peace and siblinghood, and yet, when they sat themselves down in a room together to do it again, they fought. They bickered. They antagonized. They got up and left. They naysayed or ignored. They were at war with one another. In my lifetime, America has been in a perpetual state of war. Not just the war on terror fought for nearly 2 decades in Afghanistan, only just ended, but amid a barrage of commentary demanding that it continue, but at war in Iraq twice, and a ceasefire in a war that has never officially ended in Korea, and to this day fighting wars covertly in innumerable nations. But also domestically, we wage a war on drugs, war on crime, war on poverty, a war on the pandemic. Our nurses and doctors and EMT and police are called frontline workers, utilizing military jargon. Our presidents brag about being wartime commanders-in-chief for a public health struggle that requires empathy and cooperation, not division and confrontation. We're now in a war between left and right. We're approaching a year since that war reached the steps and halls of our nation's capital. And it's worth remembering that the man whose birth we celebrated yesterday shared a jail cell with Barabbas, an insurrectionist who attempted to start a violent civil war against the Roman Empire. He and Jesus probably had a lot in common. They both knew the score. They both knew that Rome didn't care about the multitude of poor, starving, and oppressed under their eagle crest. But they went about their resistance in vastly different ways. Barabbas chose war. Jesus chose peace, and which one got crucified? We've been at war for so long and in so many different ways that the word peace, the idea of it, has been nearly lost as any substantive or practicable state of being. We've had to reduce it, commodify it, make it more manageable in order to keep it around, keep it in the lexicon. When we've got a multi-trillion-dollar local, federal, and international machine of war humming along at all times at peak efficiency, we turn peace into a Hallmark card. War is not over. We're more afraid of one another and our circumstances than ever before. But siblings, it's a choice. If we want it, we can choose not to have a war on poverty, not to confront, but to collaborate, to communicate with the impoverished. What do you want? What do you need? We can choose not to have a war on drugs, criminalizing a disease of which any one of us at any moment could fall susceptible given the rates of pharmaceutical distribution and brokenness of mental and physical health care in this country. We could empathize and assist the addicted and try and compassionately provide safe and sustainable relief and peace they seek from their ailments. We can choose not to have a war on terror, which is just fear incarnate, and instead collaborate to create sustainable global infrastructures of education, energy, and alliance, so that the fear-mongering zealots who wish to impose their power have no hold. To spend the money not on gun barrel nation building, but on international diplomacy. Shift our Defense Department budget to the State Department for just 1 year and see what happens. Invest in NGOs instead of weapons contractors for 1 year and just see what happens. Now, these macrocosmic concepts are, of course, elusive, but they can stir in us the more consequential, personal, and deeply close choices that we can make in our communities and our lives. We don't need to wait for the world to catch up with our own spirits. We can stop being afraid and start loving on the street level now. We can disengage from social media conflicts. Delete your Facebooks. Delete your Facebooks. And start engaging our neighbors even when we seem to live in different worlds altogether. It's not easy. It's frustrating and scary. It requires from us a sacrifice of comfort and maybe even safety, but it's love. We can try and make up for the deficit of mental health care in our communities by being compassionate and forgiving in our day-to-day interactions. We can simply ask other people, how are you doing? No, really, how are you doing? And be open to whatever the answer is. We can seek therapy or counseling for ourselves when we feel our own inner turmoil is so much that we might never break the patterns of harm and trauma that we've inherited. We can put our money where our heart is, supporting organizations struggling to build peaceful, sustainable ways of living in our communities. We can choose to decenter our social locations as the societal norm and learn and immerse ourselves in culture and perspectives from others. The fear and guilt dissipating, replaced with understanding and shared life-affirming priorities. We can choose not to surrender our often justified fears of being misunderstood, neglected, and cast off, but bravely continue to be vulnerable to one another. Express our own needs, express our own creative solutions, express our love, and simultaneously be open to all those expressions from our fellows. We can choose to get the band back together, man. Come back and sit down like the Fab Four finally did. Because it took the adolescent, the spiritual, the middle of the road, and the steadfast, all together to collaborate and make something magical happen. If only one more time. They let one another know they loved each other and made some of their most enduring and beautiful music in that last session together. It only lasted a few more months, but none of us will ever forget those shaggy dudes on a rooftop that cold January morning. It's indelible. It's miraculous. John Lennon, in his later years, worked through a lot of his problems. He let go of a lot of his inherited fear and anger. The loss of his mother as a child had left a hole in him that marriage and parenthood, after his second attempts, helped him fill. He got clean after many attempts and no longer self-medicated or distracted himself with substance abuse. His songwriting became even more accessible, somewhat more domestic, taking some pages from Paul's book after all. No longer in conflict with his brother, but now a lot like him. He found some peace through his life choices. And of course we know that like that man Jesus he got in trouble for comparing himself to, John met a violent end despite the peace he found 41 years ago this December. But we shouldn't be discouraged by that. We shouldn't count that as some sort of loss. That's a war mentality, winning and losing, not a spirit of peace. Peace is so much more complicated. Peace requires so much more agility and flexibility, improvisation, trial and error, openness. Peace isn't a fight, it's a dance. And John tried to teach us that. So did the other guy. And we can still learn it. We just have to choose to. War is over if you want it. A very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Let's hope it's a good one, without any fear.
Thank you for joining us. For 100 years, All Souls in Tulsa has been a beacon of this free faith. We offer our services and programs freely online for all those who are interested. You can help us to do this by making a one-time gift today or a reoccurring pledge. We really appreciate you joining us and being a part of helping us make All Souls in Tulsa what it is. Thank you.
So this is Christmas. What have you done? Another year over, a new one just begun. And so this is Christmas. I hope you have fun. The near and the dear ones, the old and the young. A merry, merry Christmas and a happy new year. Let's hope it's a good one without any fear. And so this is Christmas. Weak and for strong, for the rich and the poor ones, the road is so long. And so happy Christmas for black and for white, for the yellow and red ones. Let's stop all the fights. A merry, merry Christmas and a happy new year. Let's hope it's a good one without any fear.